First, a content warning. Today's conversation covered the topic of suicide briefly, so please feel free to stop the recording and take care of yourself if that is something you need. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Oberski. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a PhD candidate in the entomology program at the University of California, Davis. And today I'm excited to welcome you to a conversation in my series of panels about mental and chronic illnesses in academic professional development. This project is supported by the UC Davis Grad Pathways Institute for Professional Development through the program called Professors for the Future. I have several guests today. Thank you all for being here. And before we start, I'd like each of you to briefly introduce yourselves with your name, pronouns, and your professional titles, where you're at, that sort of thing. Can we start with Geoff?
Yeah, my name is Geoff Attardo, he, him, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology here at UC Davis, and I study the biology of insect vectors of disease and their relationships with ecology and interactions and things like that. And I have kind of struggled with anxiety, depression, and attention deficit disorder.
And Lisa?
Yes, I'm Lisa Whitten, and I'm an associate professor at SUNY Old Westbury since 1986 in the psychology department. I'm retiring at the end of this year, which I'm thrilled about. And I use she, her, and my work has been mostly on bringing culture and race to the center of the undergraduate psychology curriculum. And I've struggled with anxiety and depression all my life, and then was diagnosed with bipolar 1 about 20 years ago when I had a severe year-long manic episode precipitated by a medication that was supposed to be a mood stabilizer, but instead was elevating my mood, and caused a lot of trouble. It took me 9 months to be stabilized again. And that's my experience. I've written about it in an article, which we can reference somewhere, I guess. And I just wanted to say also that I've been diagnosed with ADHD, but I read an article in the Times or somewhere just today that made it sound like I don't have ADHD because I didn't have it as a child. But anyway, that's something I struggle with too.
Lisa, I read that article as well, and I think it's something I won't say in polite company.
Okay.
My name is Ariel Lambe. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Connecticut. I'm a mom of 2, and I had a severe postpartum mental illness episode in 2013, 2014, 2015. Finally got help in 2015 and was diagnosed with bipolar 1 and OCD. And at this point, I am completely out about these conditions after a period of silence, and am looking forward to this conversation and other conversations that I'm involved in about really putting myself out there and having those tremendous respondents say, in my direct messages or my text messages, I wish that I could be as out as you are. I'm looking forward to that in the future. That just fuels me right now, that the number of people that have come forward to me and said, it's so meaningful to me that you're being so out. So that's what's driving me. That's my full motivation. And I'm on that note, delighted to be part of this conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So it sounds like all of you are pretty public with your diagnoses. How did you come out, so to speak, and how public are you with this? I know some of you, it's like right there in your Twitter bio. Others, it just came up in conversation. What has that looked like for you in terms of disclosure to certain audiences?
Well, I can start. I would say I'm not totally out, and it's been a lengthy, challenging process. I first talked about my mental illness publicly in 2009 when I was able to do a short speech as I accepted the Distinguished Psychologist Award from the Association of Black Psychologists. And I talked for about 7 minutes. Many of the people in the room have witnessed me at the convention in 2001 when I was really in bad shape. But I talked about it there, and it took many years before I wrote about it. And I wrote about it because my colleague let me know about this special issue on the lived experience of mental health practitioners with mental illness. I sent the article to a number of my colleagues, some of whom I'm very close to, and to a number of my friends. And I must say the part of the coming out process for me that's been challenging is that I haven't been comfortable with, I haven't gotten the response that I wanted, which is just some acknowledgement that I have written about it and come out, and or even somebody saying, this is, I see what you're trying to do here, Lisa, and I think here are some ways you could improve it next time. That's what I was hoping for from some folks in my department and a committee I'm on through the Association of Black Psychologists. So, I have to say briefly that this semester, I've talked about subjectivity and the stigma of mental illness in my counseling psychology class, but I have not come out. It's always scary, and I'm telling myself, okay, it's your last semester, it doesn't really matter. But I'm so concerned about how it will impact my students and their opinion of me.
Yeah, I guess I can go next. Yeah, I didn't really talk about, I mean, for a long time, I had sort of internalized it and didn't realize what was wrong. And I had very low self-esteem and just assumed that I was lazy, or that I was not good enough relative to other people, and that's why I was struggling so hard, or I wasn't trying hard enough. So it made me, so a lot of it, I didn't want to feel like I was just sort of making excuses. I guess that was my big fear, is that people would think I was just sort of inherently kind of flawed and not not deserving of sort of consideration. And getting help and sort of being able to actually identify what the problems were and understanding those problems has turned my view around. It's really helped my self-esteem, and sort of understanding. So my background is I grew up, I've always had ADHD. I didn't realize that's what the problem was. Like, all of my teachers in high school were like, he's got so much potential, but he doesn't live up to it. He's always goofing off. His performance is all over the place. He gets an A and then an F and then, and it was always put on me as being like, you're not applying yourself. And it's just, but you're working as hard as you can, and and so I was besides that, I was growing up, both my parents were alcoholics, which, does all sorts of things. It was not, you don't realize it while it's happening, but you realize it after the fact when you start to contextualize, like, not everybody grew up with this kind of crazy environment. And the sort of the pathology of adult children of alcoholics is like, I have and I didn't realize what that was either. So that feeds into the attention deficit disorder and the depression and the anxiety. It all comes along as baggage with that. And the thing that so I hadn't really talked about it until I started doing, I had been on antidepressants for 20 or 30 years now, doing talk therapy. It kind of like made the symptoms tolerable and I was able to manage, but never felt good. And then I started doing ketamine infusion therapy last year, and that has been life-changing for me. It it provides it gives you the ability to step outside of yourself and look at yourself from a different perspective, with empathy and with understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. And it's just it's really like turned my life around. So that's one of the, I'm really a big proponent for the use of psychedelic kind of modalities, which are now becoming sort of accepted and mainstream, because it's the only thing that's ever really helped me, because all the antidepressants seem to be just doing is like painkillers, you know what I mean? They're suppressing the symptoms, but they don't get at the root cause. And that's really where the psychedelics get to, is that they allow you to see where the pain is that you've been suppressing for decades, that is always in the background for everything. And that's really what has been. So I came out of that therapy wanting to, just with this like feeling like other people need to know about this, because I, was suffering with this for so long, thinking it was just a character flaw in me, and that's not the reality, and that, but I've been vocal about it on Twitter, but I usually don't get any responses. I've gotten private messages back, but a lot of people don't want to engage publicly about it. And I always worry that I'm oversharing, or that I'm being inappropriate. So I've somewhat dialed it back, because I don't want to force it on people who don't want to hear it. But I also want people who are suffering quietly to know that there's options out there, and that it's not you that's the problem. So that's kind of my background and motivation.
I hear that, Geoff. I have gone from almost entirely silent to very, very public in the last 3 years. And the concept of oversharing grates on me. I mean, I think I don't know, if you're sharing something really like physically revolting, then maybe that's oversharing. But I don't really believe in the concept. People are welcome to block me if they don't like to see what I post. You know what I mean? Or just
Yeah.
unfollow me or whatever. I think not to question what you're saying. I mean, I get the feeling. I've had that feeling a million times. Oh my gosh, what did I just do? Why did I share that? But I've really become pretty strident about the fact that what matters is those people who do DM you and say that you're telling my story. This is
Yep.
so meaningful to me. Those are the people that matter, not the people who are like, oh, I don't want to hear about your depression again.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
I don't have any tolerance for those people. I think it's stigma, it's ableism, and they're just free to ignore it.
Yeah. For me, the concern, I guess, as a professor, like if I'm talking about it with students, is that it could be seen as like me kind of like trauma dumping on people, and people who there's a power dynamic that they don't have the ability to say, I'm not comfortable with this. So that's sort of where my concern comes in. Like with peers, I have no problem sharing, but I don't want to be forcing something on people that don't have the option or don't feel comfortable saying, I'm not comfortable with this. So and like apparently with ADHD, like sort of oversharing is like a common thing, because you just talk about what's on whatever is front of mind, and there's sort of like a lack of inhibition. So there's this self-consciousness that I have, that I'm worried that like, oh, I'm behaving in a strange way. So I also have social anxiety. So I'm constantly overthinking like, oh, I said something and then I'll ruminate about it and worry, and so it's all part of the whole package. But
Yeah, no,
sounds
that makes
very
complete sense.
It sounds very familiar to me. And I never thought of, I hadn't heard that term trauma dumping before. That's an interesting one. I've shared with students in my office a few times, and they have generally, and it's been after they told me about their mental health issues, if I'm remembering correctly, and they've just been sort of relieved and, you know, grateful, you know, that I shared that with them. I think one of the most difficult things for me was, maybe this is getting into a different topic, Jill, you can stop me if you want to, but when I was at the height of my manic episode 20 years ago, 22 years ago, I literally started standing up and screaming at a meeting, and department meeting with me for 15, 16 years, some of them, and I stormed out of the room, and no one came after me. No one did anything. No one called me. No one texted. Were we texting then? I think so. No one emailed me. And I was, and these are psychology professors, several of them clinicians. And I just was, you know, blown away by that. And I call it a mental health emergency, and that people need to know how to respond to that. That if I had had a stroke, if I had, you know, had a heart attack, people would have jumped up and gotten, you know, called university police. But instead, they just, the term I kept using when I was, I call it being sick when I was in my manic episode, was they just left me flapping in the breeze. They didn't know what had happened, where I had gone. And I think that's grossly inappropriate and potentially damaging. It damaged me because it made me not trust them anymore.
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference between when we're outed by our symptoms or our experiences, like when we haven't willingly said, I live with bipolar disorder, but instead have had an episode that is severe or an emergency enough that people around us are aware that something's wrong. Like, that's being outed, I would say, in the way I think about it, rather than coming out, right, in a way that you control or that you feel comfortable with. And I've absolutely had the same experience, Lisa. I'm so sorry that you experienced that with your colleagues, but I've had that experience with friends. I've had that experience in public, where I've been completely out of control, and people just don't know what to do, or they don't care to do anything, you know, and it's extremely frustrating.
They know what to do, and they're afraid to do what they're thinking. I don't know, it might be a combination of all of those, but instead of doing something, they so often do nothing. And I think that's a real mistake. In relation to this, I'll share with you that, and it's in my article, but I made a list of people, emergency contacts, and said something about, this is how I will look if I start falling apart again. And I gave it to my my dean. And I never gave it to HR, but I think it's possible to do that, because with this HIPAA stuff, people are afraid to do anything, because I think that they should have called my parents. They should have called my sister. They should have called somebody. And so now I've given permission to some people. One of my closest colleagues has the list, and I think that's something that people might consider doing, especially those of us who can go way out of control and just be irrational and in real trouble.
That's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving people examples of what to look for instead of just keep an eye on me, I think is a really, really important part of that. I want to shift us toward talking about the academic professional development timeline, and how disclosure is something that might impact your job application or interview process. I mean, disclosure or just psychiatric illnesses themselves. How do you account for that, or how does one account for that if they know they have a diagnosis and they're starting, the uncertain short-term positions and job applications that are oftentimes very demanding for the interview process, that sort of thing. What thoughts are coming up?
Well, I think people should be very careful and give a lot of thought to how much they disclose, and take into account the context, and consult people that they're close to, because of, we're still, our society is not ready for this yet, and it, where you live, I mean, it's so much depends on, again, your context. But I would recommend that people be very careful. At the point I'm at in my career, it's not as relevant, and I haven't had a manic episode in over 20 years. I've just been on the same medication. As I say, it was precipitated by a particular medication, and it just took me a long time to figure out what it was. So, but I have thought about putting the name of my article on my resume, because I'm looking for part-time work, and I'm wondering how people might respond to that. And, so I'm still thinking about it, but I would say be careful and consult people that you trust, and sort of test the water, maybe by talking to people who do hiring, or someone who does hiring, and that kind of thing.
I feel like my experience is a little bit golden. Like I just had so much good luck that I hesitate to give advice to graduate students who are confronting these issues, because I just sailed through with some really privileged junctures in my career path. So what I mean by that is I had, for whatever reason, I don't know, relative stability during graduate school. My mood, especially during my exams and my dissertation period, was really stable. I wasn't diagnosed at that point. I was in no treatment, but for whatever reason, I just got a little window there where I was okay. And that's where I did the majority of my graduate school work. I got a job before I graduated, which is like a unicorn, right? That doesn't happen. It was pure luck. It was pure luck. And I then had my daughter right after I got the job, but before I had started it. And I was able to use her birth to get myself an extra semester before I started. So the period at which I was the most out of my mind after her birth, I was not yet working. By the time I started my job, I was still in very bad shape, and those first 2 years were really tough. But I was able to, basically, I let my life fall apart and kept my job on track. I mothered as much as I needed to mother, and I worked as much as I needed to work, and the rest of my life just completely fell apart. That was how I got through it. I don't recommend that, but that's how it worked for me. Flash forward to when I got tenure, I came out publicly on Twitter with a long thread that I had composed prior, the day after I got my tenure letter. So I was really ready to be out, but like Lisa says, you have to be careful. And I kept it a secret through my whole tenure track process. The minute I came out, I was immediately sorry that I hadn't disclosed earlier, in that I got nothing but support. I got help getting accommodations. I had an excellent experience with HR and getting accommodations. I mean, everything, like I say, it was golden. Everything was just sparkly for some reason. And again, I hesitate to use that as advice, because I know other people's experiences are not that, right? Other people have terrible experiences with HR, terrible experiences with department chairs, terrible experiences with departments as a whole, with deans, with, you know, whomever. Like, there's all these horror stories out there. And for whatever reason, I just got supremely lucky throughout the process. And so I don't know what anybody can take away from all of that. But the one thing I will say is, I have a background in union organizing, and my husband is a union organizer. And one of the things that they teach you in union organizing is, if you're scared, you get more out, right? So if you support the union and you're scared, you become the leader of the union campaign, because then if you're fired, if you're sacked for that, you have recourse. Whereas if you do it in secret and they find out and they fire you, but you haven't made anything public, you don't have any recourse. And I think that applies a little bit to disability, because I think if I had, you know, I underperformed during my tenure period. I got my book done, which is what I needed to get tenure, but I didn't write any articles in that period. And I was really well behind my peers. Had they used that as an excuse not to give me tenure, I wouldn't have had any recourse, because nobody knew I was disabled. Whereas if I had had a disability, you know, on the books, so to speak, and accommodations and all of that, then I would have had recourse to say, hey, this was discrimination. You know, I wasn't given what I needed to fulfill the tenure requirements. So that's just something to think about. Obviously, it depends on your temperament. Some people just don't have the wherewithal, especially if they're unwell, to be public, and I get that. But it's just it's one sort of twist in your thinking about it to consider, maybe.
Yeah, I think for me, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in currently if I didn't have the privilege that I had. So I come from a relatively wealthy family, so I didn't have to struggle with the financial aspects of things. And, you know, I have a marriage and a very supportive wife, and without her, I wouldn't have been able to do these things. So, I mean, in some ways, I feel I struggle with this feeling of being kind of a fraud, because I look at the people who've had to work so much harder, you know, and struggling with systemic issues that, you know, I haven't had to deal with, just because of sort of my background. But I kind of look back at my trajectory, and I can kind of see I didn't realize I was compensating for things as I was going through it, but I did undergrad. I had a fairly mediocre performance there. I worked as a technician for a long time. I went back to take classes again to be able to boost my GPA high enough to get into graduate school. I did okay with graduate school. I guess I did well in graduate school. And then I did a postdoc, but there was always this feeling in me like, I can't handle a faculty position because I'm not going to be able to keep it together enough to be that, you know, the multitasking and all that. So I went into a position as a research scientist, because I'm really good at doing bench work and doing data analysis, because I can, like, if I can do one thing at a time, I'm great. But it's when I'm getting hit with lots of stuff coming from different directions that I start to get overwhelmed, and then I will eventually hit like a paralysis state. And so I stayed as a research scientist, and, you know, everybody, all my peers are like, what are you doing? You know, you need to be going for a faculty position. And I couldn't really explain to them, like, I don't think I can do it. But at some point I was just like, all right, I'm gonna try. But there's always this insecurity, like, you know, and this feeling of being an imposter, that I don't really belong here. And I was sort of, and when I got here, you know, I've sort of managed, but I don't feel like I do anything super well. I do my best, but there's a lot of times where I'm just completely spun out, and waking up every morning with panic attacks, with palpitations, having a hard time breathing, just because I'm thinking like, I can't do this today. You know, it's like just opening my phone and looking at the inbox and seeing all the new stuff that's come up that's going to totally disrupt my plans for getting what I need to do done. And then the pandemic hit, and then like the Trump presidency, and just and the wildfires out here, just, you know, having days where it's just looks like the apocalypse, and the anxiety got to a level it had never been at before, where it was just incapacitating, and that pushed me into a place that I'd never been before, where I was, you know, not suicidal, but, you know, it was like, it would be a lot easier if I just wasn't here anymore. Cause I can't, you know, it's just, cause everything is just, you just feel like you can't escape, you know, you're just sort of under this mountain of stuff that you will never be able to dig out of. And yeah, so I mean, but then I put in my tenure package, you know, last year, and I got, you know, great reviews, and I'm like, what? This is not how I see myself. You know, I don't know, I don't understand the discrepancy between how I'm seeing me and how other people are seeing me. So I guess I hide it very well, but you know, it's usually when I'm at home alone, and in my head, that it all sort of, that's when it really kind of festers. So
I can't tell you how many people, when I came out, how many of my colleagues said, "Oh, we're so sorry, we had no idea."
yeah,
You know, and I wrote an article that came out in November, about being a mentally ill historian and sort of looking at mental illness in historical figures and so forth. And it had family history in it, and it had personal history. I mean, it was like sort of partially memoir. And I talked about some of the most extreme things that I experienced in the postpartum period, which was my first few years at UConn. And people were just totally shocked. And I can't really explain. I totally hear what you're saying, Geoff. I can't explain it either, right? Like, I was for days barely sleeping, you know, seeing things, having massive rage episodes at home, or in my car, you know, driving dangerously. I mean, some of the most typical bipolar mixed states type symptoms, that was what I was plagued with during those years, was mixed states, which is a combination of depression and anxiety, and depression and mania, sometimes called agitated depression. So I had all these terrible symptoms, and yet I was able somehow to hide them at work.
yeah,
I had a couple of instances where I had students say to me, "Professor Lambe, are you okay?" There was one instance when I was writing on the board, I had my back to my class, and I just stopped, and I just couldn't go on. I didn't, my mind went blank. I couldn't remember even what class I was teaching, let alone what I had been writing on the board. And I had this really sweet student who piped up after about 45 awkward seconds that said, "Hey guys, I think we broke her." And everybody laughed, and I laughed, and I turned around and I said, "You know what? I'm really tired. What were we talking about?" And they picked it up, and I got back on track. But like, so there were a few little cracks, mostly with my students, but my colleagues had no idea. And to this day, and I think forever, I will not understand how nobody noticed. You know, I was having suicidal ideation. I was, you know, not eating for periods of time. I mean, and people just, you forget how self-involved people are. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. It just,
yeah,
everybody is concerned about themselves, you
yeah,
know,
It
they're
can be
concerned about what
negative,
they're going through, and they just don't notice that
but
much about what other people are experiencing.
I have to say I've never talked with other faculty or other professionals about living with mental illness, and it's very affirming. And I'm really happy to have a chance to do this. And in part because, like they say, what happens in groups where people are similar. The notion of hiding and being a very good actor, because I would be very depressed but I would have to go and teach a class and act like a normal person,
Yeah.
and I got good at it. And Geoff, when you were talking, the whole part about all the moving pieces of academia, I was saying to someone just the other day, this was not the best career choice for me, because when I worked at the hospital, I went in, I saw patients, I had to write my note before I left that day, or the hospital wouldn't be paid. And I went home and that was it. But then, and this is when what I describe as ADHD kicked in, when I started teaching and I had to collect articles and I had, committees and things off campus. And it has remained very difficult for more than 30 years. And there was something else I wanted to say. The part about accommodations. I was director of disability services for about 9 years, and I was offered that position after people had witnessed my manic episode. So I was fortunate that they, I had a stretch where I wasn't in trouble, visibly. So they had reason to think that I could manage it, but that was difficult to manage also. And it never occurred to me to try to get accommodations for myself. And I think that could have helped. The one thing, I did a sort of self-accommodation, which is and I should say I put self-accommodation in air quotes for people who couldn't see that. I very early started having a teaching assistant, and I designed it so that they could learn about the backstory of being a professor and everything, but it was someone who helped me to be organized, more organized. But it's been a real struggle, and I think has definitely impacted my career trajectory. One other thing I'll say is that when I was at the height of my manic episode, people must not have been paying much attention, but again, I was hiding it. I went into the honors convocation, and I was supposed to present the awards to our people in our department. Unfortunately, it was one of the biggest classes we had ever had. I came in about 40 minutes late. I marched on to the front. It wasn't a stage exactly. It was a mess. And after that, several people went to the chair and said, "What's wrong with Lisa?" And it's something that I talked about when I was going through this. I kept saying, people were asking, "What's wrong with Lisa? What's wrong with Lisa?" But they didn't do anything about it. They didn't come to me and say, "Lisa, what's wrong? Is there anything we can do to help?" And that's what I really wanted. Is there anything I can do to help? Because the chair who told me about this said, "Lisa, 3 people came, 2 from this category and 1 from that category, and said, 'What's wrong with you? What's wrong with Lisa?'" But he didn't offer me any help either. And I could go on and on, but this is helpful for me.
Yeah, it's great to be able to talk to people who get it, it's who've been there. Yeah, it's because I think I think there's a lot of other hidden people who are going through the same thing that we have no idea are even around us, because we're really good at masking those symptoms until you're home alone, and then you just let it all fall apart.
Partly because of my experience, I noticed a woman, she's probably 30 years my junior, in another department, and she just looked off. She didn't look the way she usually did. She looked depressed, and I know what depression looks like. And so I went to her office and I asked her if everything was okay, and she started crying. She didn't sob, but she teared up and said that she appreciated me saying something. And I asked her if there was anything I could do, and I right now I don't remember what she said. It wasn't anything concrete, but I think just my saying something for her made a difference. And I should check in with her. It's been maybe a couple years. So I think if we can be more sensitive, even those of us who have gone through this and people weren't paying attention, it can help.
Yeah. This is amazing, and we are rapidly running out of time. But I wanted to sort of tie that together. Do you think it's better to just pretend everything is fine until it's not? Or is there value in coming out as mentally ill when you're stable?
I think the more transparency there can be, the better. But the infrastructure isn't there for that. And the university, I mean, I feel like I'm very supported here at UC Davis. Like department chair has been great. At one point, I went to him. Actually, it was right after I turned in my tenure package, and I said, I don't think I can do this. I had hit like a wall, and I almost quit. And they sort of talked me down off the ledge. But yeah, and so I feel like I'm supported, but then again, you know, there's a lot of, wellness seminars and things. It's like going to this thing where they tell you, you need to eat better, you need to get enough exercise, you need to get enough sleep. But then the remainder of the infrastructure is telling you they're dumping more work on you than it's possible to get done. Or the expectations, like the only way you're going to get this grant or all these papers out is to work at night and work all weekend long. Especially if you have ADHD, where you're constantly sort of trying to keep your energy focused and on task. And so there's conflicting messaging where they want to promote wellness, but the reality of the foundation of that is that, yeah, be well, but get your stuff done, and it's not possible to do both. That's just what it is.
Yeah.
I would say, again, be careful who you come out to and how and when, and consider the repercussions, and maybe find a safe place, a place that you know is safe, where you can talk about it. It's sort of what I said before, and test the water and see what might work in the context that you're embedded in. But
yeah, I think that idea of a safe place is so important. And I think of my coming out process as building a scaffolding around myself. And so I started with, the closest people to me. And then I built my scaffolding one close friend at a time. And then I started talking to colleagues who were at other institutions, sort of testing the waters. And then by the time I mean, it helped that I got tenure, right? I got tenure and I came out because I was like, okay, if it's now or never, I have this job security, I'm going to do it. But by that time, the scaffolding was already in place. And so I had practiced coming out over and over and over and over again. I knew what language I wanted to use. I knew what I wanted to say and what I didn't want to say. I had gauged people's reaction to certain things. I went over it with my therapist. Like I was very practiced by that point. I would say don't, unless you absolutely have to, decide that your first coming out or your second coming out is going to be to your department chair or your dissertation supervisor. I mean, if you can avoid it, if you have to, of course, do what you have to do. But if you can go to that safe place, like Lisa says, first, again and again, find more and more safe places, then it becomes easier to be a little unsafe.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got to the point where, especially with the ketamine infusions, it's like, you come out with this new sense of purpose, which is really sort of what's helped me. And part of it was like, if the system that I'm in doesn't want to support me, then maybe I don't want to be in it, that there's other things that I can do. So if they're not going to help me be, and I know that this is the right thing to do, like I have this certainty, like that people need to be heard and supported, and that this is a remnant of, sort of this capitalist profit at all costs. The workers are sort of an expendable resource, and that's not right. And I kind of refuse to accept that as being okay. So I'm happy to take any kind of slings and arrows at this point. Like, if it does, if they don't like it, then you can fire me. I don't care. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. Is like, I just don't, I know deep down what the right thing is, and that there are people who are hurting, and that shouldn't be the way it is, and it doesn't need to be that way. So I'm happy to sort of be on the tip of the spear for that. So
Hear, hear.
yeah.
Okay, we are running out of time, so I'm going to stop the recording here. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts with everybody today. Real lived experiences are so important to hear about. And if you want to keep talking about this later, I'm super happy to facilitate that, because I would love to keep talking to all of you. Is there anything else you wanted to share with our audience before I hit the button?
No, I think it would be nice to stay in touch, though. It's been a great opportunity to chat. I mean, I think like having support groups within your communities would be a really great thing, where people can get together and talk about their struggles without worrying about being judged or sort of having repercussions.
Yes, and I would just say, if you're struggling with your mental health, to find someone who can help you, and keep looking, and finding resources. Even if you think you can't afford it, there are graduate schools where you can get treated by a talented student, and just keep looking until you get the help you need. Don't give up.